He's very patriotic.
Jimmy, Mr. Carlson.
Tina, the kids.
All right, come on, kids. Come on. Go to the beach. Let's go. Here, bring it.
Mom, please.
Sit down. Some water, some coffee, whatever.
Is there someplace else we could go?
All right, Daddy, we're going down to the beach. We'll be back in a while.
Make sure they don't go into the water unless somebody's watching them.
No, I'm gonna let them drown.
Make sure they put their shoes on. They'll burn their feet.
Yeah, we're getting their shoes. All right, come on. Let's go.
So what do you want to talk to me about?
The government's about to deport you for certain activities.
I'm in this country since I'm 2 months old. Does that make me Italian? I'm American. And they're trying to send me back?
I could have the deportation order reviewed. Have you classified as highly sensitive for national security? I could take the government off your back if you can help us.
Usually the guys that scare me. You're the people that make big wars.
No, we make sure the wars are small ones, Mr. Palm.
Let me ask you something. We Italians, we got our families and we got the church. The Irish, they have the homeland. The Jews, their tradition. Even the niggers, they got their music. What about you people, Mr. Carlson? What do you have?
The United States of America. The rest of you are just visiting.
The president wants the noise level on the operation turned down.
Lee Harvey Oswald didn't appear out of nowhere. He was built, piece by piece, by the same machinery that manufactures loyalty, silence, and obedience. This isn't a theory. It's a pattern. A pattern that surfaces wherever power needs men who don't ask questions. Only where to stand and when to act. John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, Fred Hampton. Different lives, different movements, same outcome. And decades later, Charlie Kirk. Men on opposite sides of the political spectrum, bound by the same machinery. By 1963, that machinery had already done its work. Long before Dallas, long before Florida, long before Cuba, long before intelligence agencies learned to outsource violence, the blueprint already existed. Sparta didn't raise soldiers. It manufactured them. Boys were taken from their homes at 5 or 6 years old and placed under the authority of older boys who were encouraged to brutalize them. There was no curriculum, no comfort, no protection. Pain was the lesson. Hunger was constant. Sleep was irregular. Beatings were routine. The purpose wasn't strength, it was erasure. Identity had to be stripped away before something else could be put in its place. The only thing those boys were allowed to keep was each other. They survived by bonding. They learned quickly that isolation meant death and solidarity meant survival. Loyalty wasn't taught, it was burned in. When they reached adolescence, the system tightened. Older warriors took them as protégés, mentors and lovers, not as scandal, as design. The intimacy fused trust, obedience and identity into a single reflex. The individual disappeared into the group. By 18, the final barrier was crossed. Graduation required blood. Spartan youths were sent into the countryside at night to hunt helots, slaves who violated curfew. They hid, waited, and killed silently. Throats cut in the dark. No witnesses, no mercy. It wasn't punishment, it was ritual. Once you had taken a life inside the system, there was no path back out. You belonged to Sparta completely. The rest of Greece despised them for it. But Sparta endured. It became feared. And when 300 of its soldiers stood at Thermopylae and fought to the last man, they didn't do it because they were brave. They did it because they had been trained from childhood to believe that death inside the group was preferable to life outside it. That model didn't die with antiquity. It migrated. The same structure appeared again in Thebes with the sacred band. Pairs of bonded warriors who would not retreat because retreat meant abandoning each other. Later, Macedonia absorbed the system, refined it, and unleashed it under Philip II and his son. The result was the most effective military force the ancient world had ever seen. The principle never changed. Break the man, isolate him, bind him to a brotherhood, give him blood on his hands. You will own him forever. That same machinery reappeared in the 20th century, this time in exile camps, jungles, and intelligence programs. The Cuban exiles began differently. Many of them were loyal to Fidel Castro at the start. They believed in democracy, in justice. They believed the revolution meant reform, not replacement tyranny. They fought hard. They organized well. Through Castro's own channels, through figures like Carlos Prio and intermediaries he trusted, they built relationships that extended outward. Those connections brought them into contact with American intelligence and organized crime figures, including men like E. Howard Hunt, David Ferry, and John Martino. At that stage, they weren't assets. They were partners. Castro promised them a future, and they believed him. Then Castro turned. When he aligned himself with the Soviet Union, the men who had fought for him became liabilities overnight. Those still inside Cuba, who had any connection to American intelligence or to the earlier networks Castro himself had relied upon, were hunted down. Some were captured. Many were tortured. Others were executed or buried in prisons meant to erase them. A few escaped, but they escaped with nothing. No country, no protection, no dignity. That was the first humiliation. The second came later. When the survivors reached the United States, through escape, quiet arrangements, or later political agreements, they expected refuge. Instead, they found distance. Their defeat was inconvenient. Their cause was embarrassing. America laughed at them. Then the cycle restarted. They were recruited again, this time by a joint CIA Mafia apparatus that understood exactly what it was dealing with. These men were trained in Guatemala, the United States, the Dominican Republic. They were degraded deliberately, broken down, shamed. Their hatred was shaped. Their enemy was defined for them. Loyalty was demanded, then tested, then demanded again. They were promised everything. And again, they were betrayed. The missions failed. The fallout was brutal. More prison, more torture, more death, more men escaping with nothing but rage and memory. America laughed again. By then, the damage was permanent. A man who has been broken twice does not repair cleanly. He reforms into something harder. These men emerged as a closed, secretive fraternity, tight, disciplined, lethal. They believed compromise was treason. Negotiation was betrayal. Tolerance was weakness. Secular society itself became the enemy. Anyone who spoke to their enemy was a threat. Anyone who paused was suspect. This was the world forming beneath the Kennedy administration. Through JM-WAVE and its satellite operations, these men, trained through humiliation, bonded through suffering, armed through covert supply lines, were positioned as assets. They weren't patriots in the abstract. They were Spartans without a city-state, warriors without a homeland. They had been taught that honor only existed inside the group, and that death was preferable to betrayal. They didn't need orders explained. They needed targets justified. That is how systems like this always end. The Spartans fought to the death because retreat meant dissolution. The sacred band stood its ground because separation meant dishonor. The Cuban exiles turned their guns not because they were ordered to, but because the structure they had been molded inside made any other outcome impossible. This wasn't madness. It was design. When you build men through ritualized cruelty, when you strip away all competing loyalties, when you bind identity to sacrifice and secrecy, you don't get citizens. You don't get soldiers. You get instruments. And by 1963, those instruments were already in place, silent, disciplined, and waiting, inside the machinery that would soon converge on John Kennedy. The radicals were ready. Cuban exiles forged through humiliation and betrayal. The logistics were ready. Organized crime, perfected in secrecy and obedience. The cover was ready. Men who understood silence because they had lived inside it, formed in elite fraternities, closed universities, and military institutions that had been refining this model since West Point. This wasn't improvisation. Men like Douglas MacArthur had passed through the same furnace generations earlier. The system didn't change. It matured. The Waldorf Astoria was more than a hotel. It was a fortress of luxury, white-gloved doormen, crystal chandeliers, and the quiet hum of power behind every door. The country was broke, people lined up for bread, and yet in the middle of the Great Depression, one man lived like Wall Street had never crashed. He signed in as Charlie Ross, but everyone who mattered knew the name. Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano turned the Waldorf into his command post. He spread $100 bills like business cards, tipping bellboys, waiters, and maids enough to buy loyalty for life. Frank Costello kept a suite there, always stocked with scotch and phone lines. Meyer Lansky stopped in when he was in town. To outsiders, it was a hotel. To the underworld, it was headquarters, a marble safe house where the nation's top racketeers shared cigars, cash, and information. Walter Winchell, the fast-talking columnist with a police scanner in his veins, took shots at them in print. He said the Waldorf had become a gangster's playground, but Winchell had his own debts. He couldn't even pay rent there. Meanwhile, Luciano left tips the size of salaries. The Waldorf was the mirror of America, the image of respectability built on an underworld foundation. And 2 decades later, a new kind of empire was rising, one not made of gangsters, but of generals, spies, and contractors. The Waldorf Astoria wasn't just a hotel, it was a stage where power dressed up for dinner. Presidents, movie stars, and gangsters all used the same elevators. When Charles Lucky Luciano checked in under the name Charlie Ross, nobody asked questions. The staff didn't need to. Bellboys got $100 tips just for carrying his shoes. In the middle of the Great Depression, when New Yorkers were pawning their wedding rings for rent, Luciano was handing out cash like it was confetti. Walter Winchell, the gossip columnist who doubled as J. Edgar Hoover's unofficial mouthpiece, didn't like it. He wrote that the Waldorf had become a gangster hangout. What he didn't print was that he couldn't afford to eat there himself. While Winchell scraped by, Luciano was ordering champagne and caviar to his suite. Down the hall, Frank Costello kept a permanent room. Meyer Lansky quickly visited. The place was more than a hotel. It was a neutral ground, where deals were made, truces arranged, and fortunes shifted. By the time John F. Kennedy came into office, that world of private deals and public respectability had merged into something bigger, the invisible power Eisenhower had warned about. On January 17, 1961, 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office and gave the most haunting farewell in American history. "In the councils of government," he said, "we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." He wasn't talking about a foreign threat. He was talking about America itself, the Pentagon, the arms industry, the intelligence bureaucracy, the people who never left power no matter who got elected. He told the country to stay alert, to understand that freedom wasn't only lost on battlefields, it could be signed away in contracts. A few days later, on January 19th, Eisenhower gave Kennedy the same warning face-to-face. He told him that the real levers of power weren't on Capitol Hill. They were in the military and intelligence bureaucracies. They had grown into a machine that even presidents struggled to control. "Be careful with the CIA," he said. "They'll have you by the throat if you let them." He wasn't exaggerating. Eisenhower had seen it. He'd approved covert CIA operations in Iran, 1953, and Guatemala, 1954, both staged to protect American corporate interests like United Fruit. The missions worked on paper, but created blowback that lasted decades. By 1961, he feared that the agencies had become a state within a state. Kennedy walked into the White House young, confident, and idealistic. Within 3 months, he ran headfirst into Eisenhower's prophecy, the Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA had sold him a clean plan: land Cuban exiles on the beach, spark an uprising, and overthrow Fidel Castro. What Kennedy didn't know was that the plan had been built on lies and wishful thinking. The invasion collapsed within days. Kennedy took the blame, but he knew who had set him up. From that moment, the CIA became a problem to solve, not a tool to use. A few days later, Attorney General Robert Kennedy deported one of the most powerful men in the country, Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans mob boss with deep ties to Cuba, the CIA, and American politics. Marcello had been one of the quiet financiers behind anti-Castro operations. When Bobby had him thrown on a plane and dumped in Guatemala, it wasn't just an arrest. It was a declaration of war. And John Kennedy knew it. He told his aides he'd kicked a hornet's nest. That spring, in April 1961, Kennedy gave a speech that still sends chills through anyone who listens. He warned about secrecy and the creeping power of organizations that operated in the dark, what he called the enemy within. He was speaking about communism, yes, but also about something closer to home: secret societies, organized crime, intelligence agencies, and the corporate machinery that fed them all. He wasn't guessing. His brother had written about it already. In the late 50s, Robert Kennedy published The Enemy Within, a book about corruption in labor unions and the mob's hold on America's working class. What he described wasn't just criminal. It was systemic, a pipeline of influence that ran from the street corner to the Senate floor. By the time John was president, that system had fused with something even more dangerous: the military-industrial complex Eisenhower had warned about. Truman had built it out of fear of the Soviets. Eisenhower had expanded it to contain them. And when Kennedy took office, he inherited a monster that fed on conflict. If peace broke out, the contracts stopped. So the crises kept coming: Castro, Laos, Vietnam, Berlin, Africa. Everywhere Kennedy looked, the fingerprints of the CIA were already there. Revolutions sponsored, governments toppled, dictators groomed, and front companies in every hemisphere. If a war didn't exist, someone in Langley could invent one. Kennedy wanted to turn that around. He wanted transparency, restraint, diplomacy. He even talked privately about breaking the CIA into 1,000 pieces. But every time he tried to pull back, something exploded: Cuba, the Congo, Southeast Asia. The deeper he went, the more he realized how little of it he controlled. Eisenhower had warned him privately. The public only heard part of it. By the early 60s, America was running on 2 governments: the elected one and the one that ran itself. Kennedy had the seal on his desk, but the power was somewhere else: in the Pentagon's budget, in the CIA's field operations, in corporations with stakes in defense and oil and information. He was fighting them all at once: the mob, the agencies, the secret societies he had called out in his speech. He wanted to pull troops out of Vietnam, make peace with Cuba, open dialogue with Moscow. To his enemies, which wasn't peaceful, it was betrayal. When Kennedy took that stand, he was alone. The old alliances had dissolved. The gangsters he'd once tolerated through back channels now hated him. The intelligence men didn't trust him. The generals thought he was soft, and the corporations thought he was bad for business. Eisenhower had tried to warn him. The machine doesn't take orders, it gives them. And by November 1963, that warning had become prophecy. By the late 50s, before Miami, before the raids, before the politics turned blood red, Theodore Ted Shackley had already built himself into a prototype of what the CIA was becoming. He wasn't a charmer from Yale or a smooth operator from the OSS cocktail circuit. He was something colder, a systems man, a planner born without nostalgia, a bureaucratic blade. And in the quiet gap between 1958 and 1962, he sharpened himself into exactly the kind of intelligence officer who would collide, violently and inevitably, with the incoming Kennedy administration. Shackley came out of Berlin in 1958 with a reputation most young CIA officers could only envy. He'd learned the craft under Bill Harvey, the agency's blunt force internal legend. Harvey trusted him, rare, and pushed him hard. That alone made Shackley a marked man inside the building. Harvey's protégés shared Harvey's worldview. They believed in covert action as a first resort, not a fallback. They believed presidents should give the CIA objectives, not instructions. And they believed politicians, especially the glamour types, didn't understand what the real world demanded. Shackley took those lessons with him. He left Berlin for a couple of short tours, Japan, then Langley. But what mattered most was the mentality he carried. He'd spent his early years running assets, studying reporting, slicing through intelligence grids until he could see patterns other men missed. Now, in 1958 to 1960, he added the final skill, managing the politics behind the intelligence. He learned who to listen to, who to avoid, who could bury a project, and who could protect one. What people inside the agency began to notice was the way he could brief. Not in the theatrical sense, Shackley had no interest in performance, but in the way he could make a messy covert action look essential, clean, and inevitable. He was the guy who could walk into a room full of skeptical Washington lawyers and walk out with more funding, more support, and fewer questions. Some colleagues quietly called him a fabricator, not a liar, but a man who edited reality into something the customer could sign off on. By 1960, that talent made him valuable, and it aligned him with the faction inside the CIA that mistrusted the whole Kennedy movement before Kennedy even took office. Shackley belonged to the generation that had grown up watching presidents lean on the CIA, not question it. He had come of age under Eisenhower, a man who trusted the agency's covert arm to handle the dirty work. Shackley admired that Eisenhower didn't micromanage, he delegated. And the men around Shackley, people like Harvey, the Dulles brothers, and the hardliner planners in the Directorate of Plans, believed the world needed more of that, not less. By the 1960 election, the mood inside his circle was obvious. The Kennedys looked like trouble. Too young, too idealistic, too eager to be seen as moral reformers. Shackley didn't rant about politics. He wasn't loud. But his loyalty to Harvey, Dulles, and the old CIA guard put him firmly in the anti-Kennedy current. He distrusted glamorous politicians the way some men distrust salesmen. Kennedy was exactly the sort of leader Shackley had spent years preparing to outmaneuver. A man who demanded accountability without understanding the machinery that made accountability impossible. Then came 1961. The Bay of Pigs wasn't Shackley's operation, but it exploded the world he worked in. The Dulles era cracked. Eisenhower's old rules died. Kennedy fired Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and Charles Cabell. Men Shackley admired were suddenly humiliated. Harvey, Shackley's mentor, turned openly hostile toward the new president. Inside Langley, the feeling was that the Kennedys didn't just want control. They wanted scalps. Shackley absorbed all of it. Quietly. Coldly. In 1962, at the precise moment the CIA was being forced to reinvent itself, Shackley got the biggest break of his career. Bill Harvey pushed him into the top job at JM-WAVE in Miami, the largest CIA station in the world, the engine of the anti-Castro campaign, the beating heart of the covert war Kennedy was trying, desperately, to restrain to the Kennedy brothers. JM-WAVE would become a headache, a rival, and a rogue force. To the men inside the station, it was the last piece of the old CIA left standing. And its new chief was Ted Shackley, a man shaped entirely by the pre-Kennedy rules. Between 1958 and 1962, he had evolved from a gifted young operator into a fully formed version of the agency's hidden culture. Apolitical in theory, deeply political in practice, and increasingly hostile to the idea that elected civilians should dictate covert policy. His intelligence ties were old school. Harvey, the operator who despised Kennedy Dulles' circle, the empire builders, the European networks, where clandestine war was treated as a science, not a scandal. His political instincts leaned toward the Eisenhower model. Let the CIA run the shadows. Keep the politicians out of the kitchen. By the time Shackley took the Miami post in 1962, the collision was inevitable. The Kennedys wanted control. Shackley wanted results. The two were not compatible, and that's the version of Shackley you need to understand before we dive into the Mongoose years. The man who walked into Miami with a quiet loathing for what the Kennedys represented, and with the full confidence of the men the Kennedys had just tried to purge. He never raised his voice about the Kennedys. Not once. That wasn't his style. Ted Shackley didn't curse, didn't slam doors, didn't pound the table like Bill Harvey did when John or Bobby Kennedy's names came up. Shackley's anger ran colder. He absorbed things. He filed them. And once he filed a grievance, it stayed locked in the drawer forever. The resentment started before he ever stepped foot in Miami. He'd spent his entire early career learning under the architects of the old CIA. Men who'd built their reputations on quiet efficiency and presidential distance. Eisenhower had been the model. Give the agency a mission, walk away, and never ask how the sausages were made. Shackley respected that. That was the code. That was the world he understood. Then came John F. Kennedy, selling youth, idealism, discipline, and morals. In Shackley's view, the Kennedys wanted the CIA to fight a global street war while pretending they were running an Ivy League seminar. They wanted covert action without fingerprints. They wanted deniability without dirty hands. And then, when something went wrong, they pointed down the chain, at the men who had been trying to protect them. The Bay of Pigs was the fracture line. Shackley hadn't planned it, but he lived through the fallout. Dulles was pushed out. Bissell fell. Cabell was publicly humiliated. Men Shackley admired, men he considered pillars of American intelligence, were hauled into hearings and treated like political props. And the way he saw it, the Kennedys were using the CIA as a shield for their own misjudgment. They wanted Castro gone, but they didn't want to approve the things that made Castro's removal possible. They wanted a covert army, but they didn't want to own the consequences of feeding it. To Shackley, that was unforgivable. When Bill Harvey erupted, calling Bobby Kennedy names, drunk at his desk, raging about amateurs trying to run professional war, Shackley said almost nothing. He sat in the corner listening, eyes calm, memorizing every slight the agency had taken. Harvey was the loud version of the resentment. Shackley was the quiet one, and the quiet ones were always the more dangerous. By 1962, the split was complete. Kennedy wanted control of Cuba policy, and he wanted to put restraints on the very operations he was simultaneously demanding. And Shackley, now being slid into JM-WAVE by Harvey, saw exactly what was coming. Miami was a pressure cooker. The exile groups were furious. The agency's old guard was wounded. Organized crime contacts were circling. The Pentagon wanted escalation, and the White House wanted plausible deniability. And into that furnace stepped Ted Shackley. He ran JM-WAVE like a corporate rebellion. Polite smiles, clean paperwork, bare-knuckle results. He made sure the president's brother never saw the things he didn't want to see. Shackley learned to read Bobby Kennedy the way he read the Hmong guerrilla commanders years later. Figure out what he wants, give him just enough to keep him away, and keep the real work in the rooms where he can't reach. He didn't rant about the Kennedys. He simply wrote them out of the equation in his own mind. To Shackley, politicians came and went. Presidents came and went. But the CIA, the real CIA, the one built by Dulles, Wisner and Harvey, was still the only institution capable of shaping outcomes in the shadows. And when Kennedy began tightening the reins on the exiles, shutting down freelance raids, demanding control over Mongoose and the Miami machine, Shackley didn't see a president acting responsibly. He saw an obstacle, a man getting in the way of history, a man who didn't understand what he'd unleashed. Shackley wasn't a conspiracy theorist, but he understood power, and he understood resentment. And by the fall of 1963, that resentment was a forest fire running through the anti-Castro world. There were CIA officers who hated the Kennedys, exile leaders who wanted revenge, mobsters who felt betrayed, operators who believed the brothers had stabbed them in the back. Shackley didn't light that fire, but he didn't try to put it out either. He just kept the machinery running, the money flowing, the agents active. And when the dust settled after Dallas, Shackley stayed exactly who he'd always been. Calm, silent, and deeply unmoved by the idea that a president's death changed the rules. For Ted Shackley, the hatred was never shouted. It was simply absorbed, like everything else he dealt with in the dark. On paper, JM-WAVE was just another CIA station, the field arm of Operation Mongoose, answering Robert Kennedy, Ed Lansdale, and a little Washington control board called the Special Group, augmented. In the memos, the chain of command was neat. The Kennedys set the objectives, the group signed off, Miami executed. In reality, Richmond Naval Air Station turned into something else. The size of the place, the number of people on the books and off, the sheer volume of money and hardware moving through it, gave JM-WAVE room to maneuver in ways the White House couldn't see and couldn't really stop. Kennedy could talk publicly about limited, controlled pressure on Castro. Out at Richmond, the machine he'd authorized was running continuous sabotage prep and building a standing paramilitary capability 90 miles from Cuba. In Miami's Cuban neighborhoods, which translated into power. JM-WAVE functioned like a government in exile with a better budget. It paid stipends, handed out weapons, and decided which exile groups got training, boats, radios and missions, and which ones sat in the cafes and watched. Little Havana became a permanent recruiting ground. Brigade veterans, ex-cops, businessmen who'd lost houses and sugar mills, young hotheads who wanted back in at any price. The station turned that anger into a roster. Teams, cells, boat crews, infiltrators. Even after Washington started winding Mongoose down, what was left behind was a seasoned network of commandos and operatives who knew the routes, the contacts, and the craft, and no longer needed a presidential program to keep moving. None of that worked without money. JM-WAVE sat plugged into the agency's shadow finance system. Cut-out companies with bland names, lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear, banks in places where questions didn't get asked. The station lived in the same ecosystem as covert bankers like Paul Helliwell, right-wing millionaires like William Pawley and their Texas oil friends, and the corporate fronts and shipping outfits scattered across the Gulf and Caribbean. That combination gave the CIA a flexible funding arm. When official appropriations hit a wall, money could still slide through a law office in Miami, an account in Nassau, a charter company with one airplane and no obvious business, and end up buying fuel, explosives, or a safe house for a team that technically didn't exist. Look at the personnel, and you see the rest of the story. JM-WAVE was staffed by men who'd already done this elsewhere. Guatemala in '54, Havana before the fall, the early moves in Asia, and who would later show up in Laos and Vietnam. What they built on that abandoned airfield was an operating template. A large paramilitary station sitting on US soil, fed by offshore finance, run through deniable assets who could be cut loose if things went bad. The same pattern, same kinds of officers, same kinds of banks, same kinds of fronts, shows up again in Southeast Asia, and, years later, in the off-the-books supply networks of Iran-Contra. JM-WAVE wasn't just a Cuba project. It was a prototype for how the covert state would do business for the next 25 years. On the southern edge of Miami, past the motels and palm trees and the pastel postcards of US-1, there was an airfield that didn't look like much. Richmond Naval Air Station. Old Navy property, handed off to the University of Miami for research, left to bake in the Florida sun. Empty hangars, cracked tarmac, a ghost of the last war. Then, in early 1962, the ghost got a second life. The university cut a deal with a company nobody had ever heard of, Zenith Technical Enterprises. A name that sounded like it should be fixing radios or selling parts out of a warehouse. In reality, it was a CIA mask. Behind Zenith, the agency moved its Miami station, JM-WAVE, out of low-rent safe houses in Coral Gables and into a full-scale, covert base on that dead airfield. From the outside, it still looked abandoned. On the inside, it became the capital of a secret war. February 1962 is when everything snaps into place. In Washington, Kennedy signs off on a new anti-Castro program, Operation Mongoose, and hands it to his brother and a handful of operators who think in terms of sabotage and hit teams. At Langley, the word goes out, Miami is the cockpit. If you're going to hurt Castro without a real invasion, you do it from South Florida. That's what JM-WAVE is for. The timing couldn't have been worse for the Kennedys, and better for everyone who wanted a permanent underground. War Cuban exiles were pouring into Miami by the thousand. Little Havana filled up with men who'd lost everything. Soldiers, cops, landlords, enforcers, student leaders, small-time racketeers with big-time grudges. To the CIA, they were an instant army. To the exiles, the expansion at Richmond looked like a promise. After the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, here was proof that Washington was coming back for a rematch. Inside the wire, JM-WAVE grew like a weed. What had started as a small station became a covert city. Hundreds of American staffers, thousands of Cuban assets, warehouses and motor pools, radio shacks, training ranges, classrooms, safe houses, armories. The agency had never run anything like it on US soil. It was a field station, a logistics hub, a training school and a war room, all hidden under the cover of a university research contract and a fake company with a fake name. From the start, the place reflected one thing, the way the CIA wanted to fight, not the way the Kennedys wanted to talk. The paramilitary officers were the old OSS breed, guys who'd done behind-the-lines work in Europe and Asia. They were used to sketching a plan on a napkin over drinks and turning it into a raid by the end of the week. The new station leadership tightened the screws. Everything had to be logged, briefed, signed, and folded into a structure that gave Langley deniability and Miami flexibility. It was a strange hybrid, cowboys in the field, accountants on top. The money made it possible. Officially, the salaries, rent, fuel and basic gear came through the CIA budget and the Mongoose pipeline, blessed by the same White House that wanted to keep its fingerprints off anything explosive. Unofficially, the station was plugged into a wider shadow economy the agency had been building since the China days. Cut-out companies, friendly lawyers, banks that didn't ask questions. Miami was full of those people. Covert bankers who knew how to make dirty money look clean. Old China hands who'd turned wartime connections into peacetime fronts, anti-Castro millionaires who didn't trust the Kennedys but were happy to bankroll exile gunboats. From the Cuban side of town, JM-WAVE came to look like a government of its own. It handed out stipends, guns and boats. It controlled access to training camps and missions. It decided which exile groups got attention and which ones got ignored. If you wanted to hit Cuba, you needed someone at Richmond to sign off, supply you, or at least look the other way. The official chain of command ran up through Langley and into the Oval Office. The practical chain of loyalty ran sideways to case officers, trainers, paymasters, and the quiet Americans who kept the operation alive even when the politics in Washington soured for the Kennedys. This was the trap. On paper, JM-WAVE was their instrument. Mongoose was their program. They could send RFK down to walk the camps, meet the exile leaders, give speeches, and demand briefings. They could make Miami feel like it answered the White House. But once the machine was built, once the camps and supply lines and offshore contacts existed, it had a life of its own. You could slow the money. You could kill the official program. You couldn't untrain the men or unbuild the networks. By the end of 1962, after the missile crisis, Kennedy began moving away from the path that had created JM/WAVE's empire. He started to pull back from the edge on Cuba, entertain back-channel messages, talk about avoiding another war. In Washington, the language shifted from liberation to stability. In Miami, nothing about that felt like stability. To the exiles and the hardliner operators, it sounded like retreat. They kept their guns. They kept their boats. They kept their hatred. JM-WAVE sat between the two worlds, the president who wanted out and the underground that had no intention of standing down. That's what JM-WAVE was in its prime. Not just a CIA station, but a sovereign little war state on a dead airfield, built in the Kennedys' name and rapidly slipping beyond their control. A place where anti-Castro rage, agency culture, private money, and Cold War paranoia all met under fluorescent lights and false company logos. Officially, its target was Havana. In practice, it helped create a class of men and a way of operating that treated presidents as temporary and policy as something to be worked around, not obeyed. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 flew over Cuba and came home with the kind of pictures that start wars. Soviet MRBMs on pads, IRBMs in the pipeline, missiles aimed at American cities. By the morning of the 16th, Kennedy had his war cabinet in a tight room that would be known forever by a single word, XCOM, arguing about how many runways and launchers to bomb and how soon to send Marines ashore. The generals wanted an airstrike, maybe an invasion. Kennedy said no. He picked a naval quarantine, a blockade by another name, and took it to the country on October 22nd. Behind the cameras, he was gaming out the trade. Their missiles in Cuba, for ours in Turkey. For 6 days, the White House ran on coffee and fear, while destroyers tailed Soviet freighters in the Atlantic and Strategic Air Command went to the brink. On October 28th, after back-channel notes, a private assurance from Robert Kennedy that Jupiter missiles would quietly leave Turkey and a public pledge not to invade Cuba, Khrushchev blinked. He pulled the missiles. Kennedy got the headlines, the partial test ban treaty the next year, a thaw in Berlin. But on Cuba, the obsession stayed. Mongoose, the big, messy, covert program to get rid of Castro, was declared dead and immediately reborn under new names and new bosses. That's the part most people miss. The label changed. The cast didn't. The work kept pulling from the same wells: Cuban exile groups out of Miami, organized crime brokers in Florida and Louisiana, and back-channel fixers tied into the Pennsylvania network that ran freight, unions, and favors. Those three worlds, Santo Traficante in Tampa, Miami, Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Russell Bufalino up in the coalfields, were already under Robert Kennedy's lights. He was squeezing them while the CIA still needed their channels for boats, guns, and deniable muscle. Into that soup walked Lee Harvey Oswald, ex-Marine, short-lived defector to the USSR, back in the States pretending to be a one-man fair play for Cuba movement. That movement already existed with real offices in New York and even sympathizers in London. After the Bay of Pigs, 1 million people marched overseas against US policy. Oswald saw an angle: build a pro-Castro face the public could understand and hate. Hand out leaflets. Pick a fight. Get a camera. The scuffle with Carlos Bringuier of the DRE, the anti-Castro student outfit, wasn't an accident. They'd crossed paths 3 times before the street theater that got Oswald arrested and into a radio studio. Watch the TV interview. The host unexpectedly grills him on Russia and his marriage to a Soviet wife. Oswald looks surprised the man knows the file. He shouldn't have been. The setup was a classic: anti-Castro cutouts and friendly hands inside the security world, steering him into the role of the perfect Patsy, an American who sounded like Castro's cousin. Oswald's circle didn't read like a Marxist book club. Guy Bannister in New Orleans. David Ferry, a pilot who did work for both anti-Castro camps and the wrong kind of Italians. DRE kids who liked headlines and speedboats. Files hinted at Oswald turning up at exile training grounds, the same camps retooling in case Washington greenlit a second try at the Bay of Pigs. The boys in the swamps believed they'd get Cuba back. Then they learned Kennedy was exploring back channels to Khrushchev and even to Havana through journalists who could reach Castro's number 2. The plan on paper shifted. If Castro went down, a friendly successor would kick out Moscow, keep the revolution's land and factories in Cuban hands, and shut out the old American casino money. That killed the dream for Miami and Tampa. Even a clean hit wouldn't bring back the Riviera or the Tropicana. If you were Oswald and thought you were auditioning for history, you started to realize you were a prop. Meanwhile, inside the government, Mongoose was coming apart before the missiles were even spotted. In early October 1962, the special group, Augmented, the interagency brain for Cuba ops, couldn't agree on basic sabotage. William Harvey, CIA's hard man on Cuba, was catching heat from General Ed Lansdale and Robert Kennedy for not producing results. On October 16th, while XCOM was meeting for the first time, Robert Kennedy ducked out to rip the Mongoose crew. Richard Helms came in for Harvey and took the blast. RFK ordered daily 9:30 a.m. huddles to push sabotage. They lasted 48 hours. The missile crisis blew the calendar. Harvey didn't wait for orders. He pushed every single team and asset we could scrape together toward the island, his words later, so they'd be in position if shooting started. When RFK found out, he wanted Harvey gone. The two were oil and water. Harvey had told him flatly, "Without US troops you won't overthrow Castro, and you can't hide the fingerprints." He offered to resign. He didn't need to. The ground shifted under him anyway. On October 27th, while a U-2 was shot down over Cuba and another nearly got killed over Siberia, Kennedy wrote Khrushchev, "Lift the quarantine, guarantee Cuba's safety, and end this." The big pieces locked on November 20th. The Soviets took the Il-28 bombers out and, over Castro's objections, quietly removed tactical nukes the Americans didn't even know were there. That same week, George McManus at CIA drafted the obituary. Mongoose had been political cover more than an operational plan. The White House needed something after the Bay of Pigs. It effectively died the moment the leader-to-leader letters flew. He moved to wall CIA off from Oval Office micromanagement again. Even then, Kennedy kept his options. He wouldn't sign a formal no-invasion pledge at the UN. He wanted deniability if Cuba cracked on its own, or if the Soviets tried something in Berlin. Inside Langley, Harvey leveled with director John McCone. Paramilitary campaigns were now unacceptable as a matter of policy. But higher authority would still demand results. The temptation, track 2, would be to throw money and guns at exile groups and pretend they could finish the job alone. They couldn't. Harvey's answer was to rewire the shop. Fold Task Force W back into the Western Hemisphere Division. Kill the cumbersome Mongoose mechanism. Let State Department babysit exile politics. Keep the capability to exploit a split inside Castro's circle. In December, the paperwork matched the pitch. Task Force W became the Special Affairs Staff, SAS. Harvey handed the keys to Desmond Fitzgerald, a polished operator who'd already learned how coups fail in Asia. At the top, Kennedy rebuilt the flowchart. Sterling Cottrell got a new Cuba coordinating committee to replace Lansdale's Mongoose circus. XCOM handled grand strategy. The 5,412 committee signed off on covert action. Robert Kennedy stepped back from daily mechanics. Nicholas Katzenbach took the clipboard. On January 22, 1963, Kennedy set the doctrine. Cuba was America's hostage, the way West Berlin was the Soviets. If Moscow moved in Berlin, Cuba would pay. On January 25th, he approved support for anti-Castro Cubans inside and outside, and told the Pentagon to prep plans with appropriate US combat elements. On February 25th, he told the Joint Chiefs, if an uprising breaks out, be ready to go. The exile map changed with the crisis too. On October 22nd, when Kennedy announced the quarantine, they thought the second coming was hours away. On October 28th, the trade felt like betrayal. On November 21st, lifting the blockade confirmed it. José Miró Cardona kept a low profile, then said the fight would go on. Rogelio Cisneros of Jura backed the deal publicly. Only Cubans could free Cuba, he said. The Second National Front of the Escambre cheered the end of the blockade. It meant they could raid again. The DRE, students with money, boats, and a taste for fireworks, wouldn't heal. They'd been battling their CIA handler Ross Crozier for months, ignoring orders to stick to propaganda. After an August raid, they refused help and got disarmed. One of them told a reporter the quiet part out loud. Now we have to work underground. Prices are high, and we have to deal with anybody we can, the Mafia and all. He described a meeting in a Miami Beach hotel with a man who looked like a movie gangster. The DRE took checks from deep-pocket anti-communists like William Pawley and Claire Booth Luce and shopped hardware through mob brokers to build their own army. Langley tried to put a leash on them. Ted Shackley, running the CIA's Miami station, JM-WAVE, told DRE boss Luis Fernandez Rocha to respect limits. No freelance hits, no press ambushes. The answer was a shrug. The DRE went over the station's head and sat down with Richard Helms in Washington on November 15th. They peddled a story about missiles hidden in caves, and then complained about Crozier. Helms warned them if US policy slid toward coexistence with Castro, they wouldn't like it. Fernandez said if that happened, they were done with CIA supervision. When another official asked for polygraphs, He said no. CIA swapped case officers anyway. On December 10th, JM-WAVE learned Crozier was out. George Joannides, cover name Walter Newby, a veteran of rough politics in Greece, was in. 3 days later, Fernandez blasted an open letter to Kennedy. If Washington made peace, the DRE would keep fighting by every means possible. The Justice Department started squeezing the freelancers. On December 3rd, U.S. Customs hit Jerry Patrick Hemming and 13 men training on Sombrero Key. Katzenbach asked J. Edgar Hoover if any of them had official cover. Hoover said no. The feds seized guns and filed Neutrality Act charges, then dropped them 6 weeks later. Hemming knew too many faces. He kept training shooters. By Christmas, FBI pressed CIA for a clean list of which exile groups were inside and which were out in the cold. Robert Kennedy, meanwhile, needed a win that didn't smell like Bay of Pigs. He revived the stalled prisoner exchange for Brigade 2506. James Donovan, the lawyer who traded Abel for Powers, had been shuttling to Havana all fall. Justice carved exceptions under the Trading with the Enemy Act, and drug companies got full retail tax deductions on donated medicine. Real money in an era of padded price books. On December 24, 1962, the prisoners came home. Kennedy met them in Palm Beach and 5 days later promised at the Orange Bowl that their flag would fly in a free Havana. It was good theater and sharper politics. RFK picked a horse, Manuel Artime, a brigade commander, not Miro Cardona. In January, he told Artime the money would come through a separate channel in Miami. It did. Artime got a secure line to a CIA officer, and by March, helped finding a base outside the U.S. He visited Luis Somoza in Nicaragua. Kennedy met Central American leaders in Costa Rica that month. The signals said, "Make room." The other comer was Manuel Rey, a former July 26th insider turned opponent. By February 1963, CIA admitted he had real backing from left-leaning Caribbean governments and from U.S. wallets. He raised union money in Venezuela, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, about $6,000 a month through a Caracas cutout, and told a CIA source his quickest path was to penetrate the militia and kill the top tier. The murder plots never really stopped. Paper later said otherwise. The logs didn't. Fitzgerald replaced Harvey atop SAS, and by Deputy Sam Halpin's account, was just as committed to killing Castro. Harvey kept his end alive through Johnny Roselli. Over the holidays into early January '63, Harvey was in Miami meeting Roselli and Marcello, paying $2,700 for Tony Verona's 3 militiamen. He spoke with Roselli by phone mid-January. Both agreed the odds were lousy. In February, Harvey flew to Los Angeles. They agreed to wind the thing down slowly and keep contact with Verona to protect sources. He said he'd cleared one last Roselli sit-down with Helms. Someone tried anyway. In March '63, Cuban security grabbed a rooftop team near the University of Havana. The date circled was March 13th. Later versions tied them to Roselli through Miami channels. Years on, Roselli told Congress he never told the Cubans the job was cancelled. FBI surveillance had Harvey meeting him in Washington in June '63, long after Fitzgerald took Cuba. Another witness placed Roselli in Florida conspiracies that fall. Inside SAS, Fitzgerald wasn't acting like a man closing a file. Early that year, he ordered a workable assassination plan and told Halpin it came from on high. Ideas got weird. Poisoned wetsuits, booby-trapped seashells, maybe slipped to Castro through Donovan's prisoner swap access while Fidel was skin diving. In the shop, killing Castro was routine business, not a special request. Sabotage came back too, under the fig leaf of autonomous groups, Alpha 66, Commandos L, with lines kept deliberately blurry. JM-WAVE had lost formal control of Antonio Veciana in November '62, and suspected Eloy Gutierrez Menoyo of being a Castro plant. But the station kept marginal interest in both. They were useful. Autonomous groups could take credit for CIA work the White House didn't want to own. On March 18, 1963, Alpha 66 hit a Soviet target, and the administration had to show its hand. State disavowed. Kennedy publicly condemned unauthorized raids on April 11th. Inside, ExComm met 3 times at the end of March, and the split was obvious. McCone wanted the raids to continue. Robert Kennedy, for once, wanted a crackdown. Lyndon Johnson agreed. Kennedy worked the angles. Raids were loud and easier to sell than deep infiltrations, and the exile lobby liked action. He wanted CIA steering the raiders and, as Dean Rusk argued, aiming at Cuban, not Soviet, targets. The Bureau would hit freelancers and gun runners. CIA would corral what it could. Back in Miami, the DRE took the hint and kept 1 foot in and 1 foot out. They raised money in Chicago and Puerto Rico and started courting Texas moneymen. They bragged about meetings in Washington and said they'd fire their CIA handler if they felt like it. Langley responded with the Joannides switch and a tighter purse, but the students thought they could muscle the agency. It wasn't bravado. They had other suppliers, private anti-communists and mob intermediaries who liked cash business and no subpoenas. And threading through it all was Oswald, building a profile the camera could recognize. Leaflets, a sidewalk bust, a radio slot, a TV turn that somehow knew his Russian biography before he sat down. He took a trip to Mexico City to beg for a Cuban visa, another piece that, on the surface, screamed Castro groupie, and underneath fit too neatly with a different assignment. David Atlee Phillips, the CIA's information man in Mexico, later wrote and talked around a meeting with Oswald there. Never straight, always sideways. The lesson plan he hinted at, shoot a leader from a high window during a motorcade, was the kind of detail you only put on paper when you're sure no one will ever see the draft. By mid-63, the board looked almost exactly like 61. Internal splits, rumors of uprisings, exiles testing boats, a standing order to have a plan. The difference was the president. After the missile crisis, Kennedy believed the uniformed side was wired to escalate, and the covert side was too used to lying to itself. He wanted options, but no trapdoors. Cuba stayed a hostage in his pocket for Berlin and a target if the island blew on its own. To the men in Miami and the operators who fed them gas money, which sounded like slow murder. To Langley, it meant improvisation and deniability. To Oswald, if he ever understood the script he'd been handed, it meant the part he was playing could be switched out overnight. The names on the memos changed. The mechanics didn't. The government kept 2 sets of books, one for treaties and speeches, one for raids and poison. The exile groups went where the money and the guns were. The mob intermediaries did what they always did, turning politics into logistics. And the young man with the handbills and the Russian wife kept walking into rooms where everybody else knew more than he did. Soviet troops were still on the island. John McCone wanted Castro out. Robert McNamara didn't argue. On April 3, 1963, the Kennedys told the CIA, turn the screws, maximum pressure. Sterling Cottrell's new Cuba committee came back with a menu: army training for exile infiltrators on US bases, balloon drops to blanket Cuba with leaflets, and sabotage of Cuban ships in foreign ports. McCone met Kennedy in Palm Beach on April 15th and boiled it down to 2 real choices: normalize relations and push the Soviets out, or push the Soviets out and topple Castro. Kennedy wanted both options ready. 10 days later, McCone put it in writing. Maritime sabotage might light the fuse for a coup, which, short of US troops, was the only plausible endgame. The president moved before the memos were dry. On April 19th, CIA cabled The Hague, greenlight Cuban shipping sabotage. On April 24th, cables went to European ports carrying a broader line: all feasible forms of pressure to generate disorder and collapse. Case officers were told to sell the pitch hard. If Cubans primed the conditions, the US would come. Into that mix stepped William Pawley, Miami tycoon, Cold War lifer, loud about regime change. He'd pitched Marines on a sugar plantation right after the Bay of Pigs and stormed out when JFK blamed US economic predation for fueling the revolution. He hated the missile crisis settlement and wanted Castro finished. In spring 1963, Pawley became the frontman for a new angle floated by John Martino and ghostwriter Nathan Whale, two ex-communists plugged into Senate Internal Security staffer Jay Sauerwein. The story, 3 Soviet technicians wanted to defect with photos proving underground missile sites still active in Cuba. Sauerwein dangled Senate testimony if CIA would extract them. Senator James Eastland rang Pawley, who smelled a chance to embarrass the White House and pry open the door to invasion. April 18th, Pawley went to Ted Shackley at JM-WAVE, the CIA's Miami station. "Turn them over to the agency," Shackley said. Sauerwein demanded delivery to the Senate in 36 hours. Shackley refused. Pawley claimed he'd get General Marshall Carter's blessing and said Carter advised no paper. Shackley, who'd used Pawley before and didn't know HQ tracked him under the cryptonym QDDALE, agreed to let Pawley approach Martino, whom Shackley himself wrote off as an unsavory character. Pawley laid out a plan: meet the Cuban pickup team on his yacht, Flying Tiger, guns aboard, with his own air cover. Whale erupted at the idea of letting CIA in. Pawley ignored him. Martino looped in Richard Billings of Life magazine, $2,500 a head for the technicians. CIA tried to kill the media angle. No dice. Shackley, Carter, and Desmond Fitzgerald, new head of the CIA's Cuba covert arm, swallowed it and allowed one life man aboard. There were no Soviet technicians. It was a rerun with different credits. Late '62, Loran Hall, one of Santo Traficante's old cellmates from Cuban jails, had reconnected with Jerry Patrick Hemming in Los Angeles. They took a Dallas-New Orleans tour through oil money, right-wing donors, and exile fixers, then headed to Miami. Hall said he'd run a couple of shipping raids in early '63 and picked up a bullet in the leg. Back in Dallas, conservative patrons funded a bigger play. Landmen in Cuba, behind a provisional government, rushed to the OAS and UN for recognition. In Miami, Hemming introduced Hall to Martino, who pitched something bigger than a raid and brought him to a hotel meet. Traficante stopped in to vouch for Hall. Then, Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli walked through the door. They put up about $15,000 for gear. Captain Bayo, a flamboyant exile veteran, took it. The real aim wasn't defectors. It was assassination. By late May, Pawley was spooked by Life's involvement. Shackley got him to cap it at Billings and called the odds 1,000 to 1, but let it run. Fitzgerald backed the call. On a June night, after a choreographed rendezvous off Florida, Pawley, Billings, and 2 CIA men watched a small boat shove off toward Cuba. Pawley later said he knew then it wasn't coming back. He was right. CIA paramilitary Rip Robertson did the post-mortem. Bayo and Martino had ignored exfiltration routes and recovery plans. They barely briefed their Cuban team. Martino acted bored. Days later, the Cuban Revolutionary Council, fronted again by Tony Verona, announced it had sent men in to invade. Manuel Artemes, MRR, checked names and found overlaps with Bayo's crew. Shackley concluded that Pawley, Sauerwein, and Life had been played and tried to salvage something for HQQDDALE, had renewed confidence in CIAs to run paramilitary infiltrations. The press had learned to stay out. And, on paper, 10 armed men had gotten in to irritate Castro, even if rolled up fast. Whether Bayo was working for Castro stays open. He'd tried a noisy defection gambit in '62 and now staged a fiasco that, if exposed, would burn Washington. Pauli took whatever he knew to the grave. In 1975, Shackley, testifying under the alias Halley, stuck to the cover story. Martino was trying to extract Soviet technicians. Easier than saying mob money financed a fake defector raid that morphed into another hit attempt. By mid-1963, Washington had revived regime change pressure without truly controlling the exiles, or the mob. And circling back into the picture was Lee Harvey Oswald. June 1962, the ex-Marine drifted home to Dallas, a city where Hall and Hemming had just found sponsors. May '63, he moved to New Orleans, a hub for exile operations and a town long farmed by Carlos Marcello's people. In June, he built a phony chapter of a pro-Castro group and promptly collided with the DRE's local arm. In Dallas, he'd befriended George de Mohrenschildt, a white Russian with business in the Caribbean who, like Hall, was dabbling in a scheme against Haiti. In September or early October, Oswald showed up at Sylvia Odio's door with Loran Hall and was sized up as a potential assassin of Castro or of the president. Late September, he tried to reach Cuba through Mexico City, likely to put himself in position for a shot at Fidel. All the while, the Kennedys kept the pressure on. On April 3rd, they had demanded maximum covert action. By late April, they were authorizing sabotage in foreign ports and telling case officers to promise help if Cubans lit the fuse. The private machinery ran on the same fuel it always had: exile zeal, agency deniability, and mob logistics. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. Robert Kennedy was trading punches with organized crime and lecturing CIA operators to deliver results. But when the government got desperate, it reached for the same cutouts. During the 6-day sprint of the missile crisis, RFK had stormed into the Mongoose shop and dressed them down, without grasping how many of those assets were wired to Traficante's Tampa channels, Marcello's New Orleans network, and the Chicago crew around Giancana and Roselli. By summer '63, the official playbook said, pressure, sabotage, readiness. The unofficial one looked the same as '61. Freelance raids, bought boats, and cash couriers who didn't ask questions. Oswald, leaflets, radio, TV, Mexico, moved along that same current, a low-rent actor in a production run by men who only played for keeps. And on November 22nd, he stepped from the edge of the web into its center, where all the threads, exiles, the agency, and the outfit's money, had been crossing for years. By 1960, the Cold War was not just being fought in jungles or deserts, it was being fought in the shadows, through cutouts, proxies, and lies. That autumn in Miami, the CIA breathed life into an old revolutionary group and turned it into a weapon. The DRE, the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, or Student Revolutionary Directorate. Originally, these were the same student firebrands who had helped Castro topple Batista in Havana back in 1959. But once Castro seized power and began purging anyone who questioned his communist drift, the DRE men realized they had been used. By early 1960, many were on the run, hunted by Castro's new regime. When they escaped to Florida, the CIA was waiting for them, with money, training, and a new mission. Turn their rage back on Havana. By October 1960, the DRE had become an American operation in everything but name. Its base of operations sat in Miami, but it had cells in New Orleans, Houston, and New York. Its leaders, Rolando Cubela, Manuel Salvat, and Carlos Bringuier, were trained, paid, and handled by the agency. The DRE's orders were simple: stage propaganda, sabotage, and street actions to create the illusion of a Cuban underground still fighting Castro. But behind the headlines and pamphlets, something darker was being tested. The DRE was a hybrid, a propaganda arm that shared streets, money, and intelligence channels with organized crime. The same men who helped the CIA move guns into Cuba during the Batista years, Rosselli, Giancana, Trafficante, Marcello, were now moving guns back the other way, this time to arm exiles. Everyone was using everyone. The Mafia wanted Havana back, the CIA wanted Castro gone, and the DRE wanted revenge. By 1963, one of those DRE cells, the New Orleans branch, was being run by Carlos Bringuier. And that's where Lee Harvey Oswald walked. On August 9, 1963, Oswald was arrested on Canal Street for disturbing the peace after a scuffle with Bringuier and two of his men while handing out fair play for Cuba pamphlets. On paper, it looked like a communist agitator clashing with anti-Castro patriots. In reality, it was theatre. The two men had already met several times before. They had talked, traded information, even shared contacts. Bringuier's organization, the DRE, was a CIA front. Oswald was playing his part in something much bigger. Even the police officers on the scene could smell it. They saw the cameras waiting before the fight even started. When they hauled Oswald in, they tried to cut him loose with a warning. But Oswald insisted on being charged, photographed, booked, and fined. He wanted a paper trailer performance on record. He was building a legend. That legend would serve multiple masters. On one hand, Oswald was laying the groundwork to get himself into Cuba, posing as a loyal supporter of Castro. On the other, he was helping people like Bannister, Ferry, and Bringuier create a file that made him look like a communist agent ready-made scapegoat for whatever came next. The connections ran deeper. The address on Oswald's leaflets, 544 Camp Street, was the same building where Bannister kept his detective office. Around the corner, at 531 Lafayette, was another of Bannister's fronts, a shell that funneled money and weapons to the exiles. The overlap was too tight to be coincidence. Bannister, a former FBI agent and rabid anti-communist, was running black operations with both the CIA and local organized crime. By mid-August, another story was breaking, one that made all of these men very nervous. Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese crime family, had begun cooperating with the FBI. His testimony, the first public confirmation of the Mafia's national structure, was leaking into the press. For the first time, the American public was reading names like Carlo Gambino, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, Russell Bufalino, and Carlos Marcello. That was the same week Oswald was arrested. While Valachi's story ran on front pages, exposing the underworld's hierarchy, Oswald's arrest did not even make the papers. It was a blip. But inside New Orleans, the two worlds were colliding. In the Camp Street network, men like Ferry, Sergio Arcacha-Smith, and Charles Spiesel were beginning to realize that the money funding their exile work, the donations from businessmen and political backers, was mob money. The same families that the Kennedys were trying to destroy were the ones underwriting the anti-Castro war. It all connected. The CIA, the DRE, and organized crime. And right in the middle of that web sat Carlos Marcello. Marcello's grip stretched from the docks of New Orleans to the casinos of Havana. He financed exile operations, owned politicians, and still had the ear of people inside the intelligence world. When Kennedy and his brother began their war on organized crime, Marcello took it personally. To men like him and Trafficante, the Kennedys were bad for business, and their crackdown on the Mafia was bleeding into the covert world that had kept the CIA fed since 1947. By late 1963, the cracks were showing. The CIA wanted control over its friendly assets in Miami and New Orleans. The Mafia wanted its money and influence back. The Kennedys wanted them all gone. And Oswald, broke, desperate, and eager to matter, was trying to prove himself to both sides at once. He built his communist persona to get a Cuban visa. He played along with right-wing handlers to show loyalty. He believed, in his strange and fractured way, that he was helping the cause. To kill Castro, to protect America, to make history. But to the people around him, he was already something else entirely. A pawn with a perfect paper trail. A Patsy waiting to be framed. The CIA, the Mafia, and the DRE had been running parallel wars since 1960. By the fall of '63, those wars were colliding, and Lee Harvey Oswald was walking straight into the crossfire. When John and Robert Kennedy entered the White House, they didn't just inherit a nation, they walked into a fortress. The guards at the gate weren't soldiers. They were men like J. Edgar Hoover, Henry Anslinger, and Allen Dulles, bureaucratic lifers who had been running Washington for decades. They didn't take orders from presidents. They outlasted them. Hoover had been at the FBI since the Harding administration, building dossiers on everyone with power. Anslinger ran the Federal Bureau of Narcotics like a one-man crusade since the 1930s. Dulles turned the CIA into a shadow government, a machine that could change the map of the world without ever asking Congress. Eisenhower had warned Kennedy about the military-industrial complex, but he'd only given him the headline. The real danger wasn't just generals and defense contractors. It was how intelligence had become its own branch of government. The CIA wasn't collecting information anymore. It was creating it, manufacturing crises, building politicians, and turning American democracy into a controlled experiment. They had learned to seed their own kind across Washington, senators, congressmen, governors, men who looked independent but owed their rise to Langley's network of money and influence. The CIA's relationships with industry, banking, and organized crime blurred into one operation. Their goal was simple: control the machinery of government without ever appearing in the photo. By the early 1960s, the US had only two parties left standing, Democrats and Republicans, but it barely mattered. McCarthyism had burned the left to the ground. Socialism was a dirty word. Both parties were now fed by the same pipeline: corporate donors, Wall Street lawyers, oilmen, and defense contractors. The system was airtight. The ideology didn't matter, the money did. Kennedy saw it. He saw the same men, old, rigid, and unaccountable, recycling power between agencies, boardrooms, and think tanks. The same hands that built empires abroad were hollowing out the republic at home. Then came the Bay of Pigs. When the plan collapsed in blood and embarrassment, Kennedy realized what he was really dealing with. He'd inherited a CIA that operated like an unregulated army, a global Gestapo with better suits. If there wasn't a problem in the world, they'd go create one just to stay relevant. The invasion had been planned under Eisenhower and Nixon, fueled by mob money, exile groups, and covert funds. When it blew up, it was Kennedy who took the hit. The old guard watched him squirm. The agency men didn't forgive him, and he didn't forgive them. Kennedy forced Allen Dulles out and brought in John McCone, a businessman who thought he could broker peace between the White House and Langley. But McCone was out of his depth. He didn't understand that the CIA didn't answer to presidents. It answered to itself. Every new crisis exposed more rot. In January 1962, federal agents in New York seized a major heroin shipment, Corsican syndicates, Italian mob connections, and a money trail that ran straight through Southeast Asia. The pipeline stretched from Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia, the same territories the CIA was using as staging grounds for anti-communist operations. The agency had taken the playbook of Paul Helliwell, the man who financed covert ops in China with drug money, and turned it global. The narcotics trade became a tool of foreign policy. Heroin profits funded black ops, and the same ships that carried arms to rebels carried opium back out. Behind the curtains stood bankers, shipping magnates, and intelligence officers who saw narcotics not as crime, but as currency. When Henry Anslinger finally stepped down, the last firewall fell. That left Hoover, who for decades had refused to admit organized crime even existed. Then came Joe Valachi, a low-level soldier who broke the code of silence. His 1962 confession blew the doors open. For the first time, America heard the words La Cosa Nostra. Valachi described a nationwide crime syndicate that had been operating since Prohibition, with its hands in everything from labor unions to Las Vegas. It made Hoover look like a fool. The FBI director, who'd spent decades chasing communists and deviants, now had to explain why he'd ignored the Mafia sitting right under his nose. The Kennedys smelled blood. Robert, as Attorney General, went at the mob like a crusader, wiretaps, indictments, hearings. But the family's old connections to organized crime came back to haunt them. Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, the same men who'd once bankrolled Democratic campaigns, now watched in fury as Bobby tried to dismantle their empires. With the mob turning cold, the Kennedys pivoted. They went for the black vote. Civil rights became the next battleground. Kennedy reached out to Martin Luther King Jr., believing moral leadership could rebuild political strength. It worked politically, but it made him enemies that couldn't be policed. White supremacists, Dixiecrats, and John Birch Society hardliners seethed. They called Kennedy a traitor to his class, his color, his country. Add to that list the Cuban exiles who blamed him for the Bay of Pigs, the CIA officers he'd humiliated, and the mobsters he'd indicted, and you had the perfect storm. And Kennedy kept adding fuel. He deported Carlos Marcello, the mob boss of New Orleans, one of the most connected men in the American underworld. Then he authorized the assassination of Rafael Trujillo, the Dominican strongman, and CIA ally turned liability. Months later, the Diem brothers in South Vietnam, Washington's puppets, were taken out in a coup that bore the agency's fingerprints. It was too much, too fast. In 2 years, Kennedy had crossed the intelligence establishment, the mob, the military, and the Southern political bloc, all while threatening to pull US troops out of Vietnam and dismantle the CIA's covert wings. To world leaders, he looked dangerous. To the power structure, he looked expendable. By late 1963, Kennedy's enemies weren't just whispering, they were converging. The CIA, the Cuban exiles, the mob, the military brass, and the right-wing underground all had one thing in common. They wanted the Kennedys gone. Robert was still swinging, but it was like punching in a dark room. He was hitting corruption, crime, and treachery at every level of government at once. He didn't realize how deep the roots ran. The Kennedy brothers had walked into a war they didn't even know was being fought. And the other side, the one Eisenhower had tried to warn them about, had already built a government of its own. On October 15th, a skinny, forgettable 24-year-old named Lee Harvey Oswald walked into a warehouse and got himself a regular job. The Texas School Book Depository was as ordinary as it sounded. Stacks of textbooks, dust, freight elevators, men who punched in, did their work, and went home. Oswald fit right in. The people around him didn't see a time bomb or a lunatic. They saw a polite, quiet guy who kept to himself. Some of them joked about his odd little haircut, his shabby clothes, the way he carried himself. He'd give a small, embarrassed smile, maybe a half shrug. That was it. No rage, no outbursts, no talk of killing presidents. If you believe the official story later, lone nut, unstable, dangerous, you'd never find the slightest hint of it in that building. On paper, he was the last man you'd pick to change history. But Oswald didn't live his real life on paper or in the lunchroom at the depository. His real life ran through the back corridors of New Orleans and the shadows of the anti-Castro war. Cheap offices, strip mall political fronts, and characters who looked like they were cast out of a bad spy movie. One of them was David Ferry, eccentric, night-flying pilot, ex-Eastern Airlines, with a skull-like face and painted-on eyebrows. Ferry had deep ties to Cuban exiles, CIA operators, mercenaries like Frank Sturgis, and the freelance spooks who lived off the chaos of the Cold War. The other was Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent who'd once been well regarded in the Bureau and in New Orleans law enforcement. Bannister ran a private detective agency that was part security shop, part political thug operation, part unofficial arm of the right-wing underground. Both Ferry and Bannister, for all their differences, had one thing in common. They worked in the orbit of Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans boss. Marcello was already on record making hard threats against President Kennedy. That was the world Oswald dipped in and out of it, not the world of a random warehouse crank. As 1962 turned into 1963, the temperature around Kennedy rose. Joe Valachi went public about the Mafia. Robert Kennedy tried to shut down off-the-books attacks on Castro, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Cuba almost turned into a graveyard for half the planet. What most people don't realize is that when Valachi was talking to Robert Kennedy about the structure and history of organized crime, the Cuban Missile Crisis was breaking at the same time. The country was staring down nuclear war, and Bobby Kennedy went from grilling mob turncoats to tearing into the CIA. He stormed down the halls of power demanding that somebody do something about Castro. He wanted results. Fast. He ripped into case officers, bureaucrats, and paramilitary planners, shredding anyone who gave him excuses. On the other side of that confrontation were some of the most hard-right, bitterly racist operators in the government and in the exile networks. Men who already hated John Kennedy's speeches about one America, no North, no South, no East, no West. They'd heard about him inviting Martin Luther King into the White House. That one act, to them, was sacrilege. These were people who were comfortable with the Mafia's help, comfortable with covert wars, comfortable with overthrowing governments. They weren't comfortable with civil rights or détente. And then Castro spoke up. On September 7th, 1963, in Havana, Fidel Castro gave an interview to an American reporter and dropped a line that made people in Washington sit up straight. United States leaders should think that if they're aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders, they themselves will not be safe. That wasn't just a threat. It was a mirror. The CIA Mafia assassination plots were either still active or had just been quietly revived. The Kennedys knew these kinds of operations existed. Sometimes they tried to direct them, sometimes they tried to shut them down. But by late 1962, John Kennedy had already started losing control of the whole mess. During the missile crisis, instead of choosing a strike on Cuba, JFK chose peace. He moved toward détente, toward a nuclear test ban, toward back-channel communications with Moscow and Havana to make sure nobody pushed a button by accident. While he was trying to step back from the brink in Cuba, he was also feeling his way toward a different policy in Asia, a smaller footprint in Vietnam, a way out of permanent war. But the machinery he'd inherited, covert action, assassination programs, exile armies, didn't shut down just because he'd changed his mind. In September 1963, while Castro was warning about blowback, Lee Harvey Oswald showed up in Mexico City trying to get himself into Cuba. He walked in and out of embassies and consulates, played his Marxist role, waved his fair play for Cuba persona like a flag, and tried to reach Havana through the proper channels. If you look at it from one angle, it's pathetic. Some confused ex-Marine trying to impress the revolution. From another angle, it lines up a little too neatly. He'd spent months building a fake identity as a communist sympathizer to open doors. Leaflets in New Orleans, staged confrontations, radio appearances, the whole act. That kind of work isn't casual. It's the kind of thing you do because you believe there's a payoff at the end, a mission, an insertion, a job to do. Now imagine what happens if somebody quietly tells him, "That's over." The attempts on Castro are dead. Kennedy shut it down. "You're not going to Cuba, go home." Then what? All that time building a cover story, exposing his politics, putting his wife and kids in a vulnerable position, burning bridges in his personal life, for nothing. No revolution, no mission, no escape. Just a lonely warehouse job in Dallas and a Russian wife he now has to drag through American bureaucracy for citizenship paperwork. If he felt used, if he felt discarded, it wouldn't take much of a whisper to aim that anger upward. At the same time, anti-Castro exile groups were still running their own operations on the side, raiding, training, planning, with and without CIA approval. The agency played whack-a-mole, sometimes funding, sometimes pretending not to see, sometimes green-lighting. Things just to keep influence. On the day John F. Kennedy went to Dallas, the CIA approved another operation against Castro. It was as if they knew the president was not coming back and wouldn't be around to blow up the contradiction. Robert Kennedy, for his part, was terrified of what a successful Castro retaliation would mean. He understood the logic. If you are trying, clumsily, repeatedly, to kill a foreign leader, sooner or later he might reach back. If Castro managed to take out an American official, or a senator, or a Cuban exile leader on US soil, the pressure in Washington for an invasion would be unstoppable. The same generals and hardliners who wanted to hit Cuba in 1962 would be screaming for war, and any war in Cuba risked becoming a war with the Soviet Union. So, Bobby tried to build a mechanism, a control room for the chaos. He wanted a way to centralize all intelligence on Cuba, anticipate retaliation, manage the story, and keep the country from stumbling into World War III. The result was something that looked clever on paper and monstrous in hindsight. The Special Group, augmented, usually shortened to SGA. The Special Group, augmented, was officially a sub-unit under the National Security Council. In practice, it was Robert Kennedy's personal command post for covert operations against Cuba. No assassination-adjacent program had ever put the Attorney General this deep inside the control structure. It was unprecedented. SGA brought everybody into one room. The CIA, packed with old hands who hated Kennedy's détente, hated Martin Luther King, and hated the idea that the president and his brother could purge the old heads who'd built the post-war covert empire, the FBI, with J. Edgar Hoover at the top, the man who in 1960 still denied organized crime even existed. There was no chance Hoover was going to turn around 3 years later and admit that the Mafia could kill a president and help elect others. To do that would expose his own decades-long failure and the compromises that kept him in power. The rumors about his sexuality, the blackmail material, his quiet relationships with mob men like Frank Costello. If the country ever forced a real reckoning, they wouldn't just ask for heads. They'd ask for Hoovers first. The Defense Department, generals, planners, and contractors making fortunes off the military-industrial complex, some of them running their own arrangements with organized crime and moving money through offshore accounts that nobody would check. The State Department, the National Security Agency, other pieces of the intelligence community. And over all of them, Robert Kennedy. No other covert structure in American history looked like that. The two brothers, JFK and RFK, were trying to stand on top of a machine that had been built to run without political oversight at all. By 1963, they knew they could only truly trust each other, and a handful of men they'd known since the war. Everyone else was suspect. CIA veterans who'd overthrown governments in Iran and Guatemala. Military brass who saw presidents as temporary. FBI lifers who'd been in Hoover's pocket since the 1930s. In trying to control that machine, Bobby Kennedy did something he couldn't take back. He created a group that would, by design, control the narrative in the event of any major Cuban-related incident, including an assassination. He also tied his own hands. His fingerprints were now on operations like Mongoose, on proposals like Northwoods, on covert actions that blurred the line between intelligence work and criminal conspiracy. If something ever happened to his brother, Robert Kennedy would be inside the very system responsible for managing the aftermath. And most of the people sitting around that SGA either despised John Kennedy, despised his policies, or saw him as an obstacle. In and around that circle were Cuban exiles, tightly linked to organized crime, men who knew that this special group existed and what it was meant to do. Now they understood that if a political killing ever occurred, there was already a task force in place to seize the narrative, to decide what the country would be told. All they had to do was feed that mechanism the right story. Cuba killed Kennedy. 1 bullet, 2 birds. Kennedy is dead, Dallas is spinning, and Lee Harvey Oswald is sitting in a police station with his head against the wall like a man waiting for a bus, not a suspect in the murder of a president. Officially, he's not even being held for the assassination. The only charge on the books is the killing of a Dallas patrolman named J.D. Tippit. But his calm is what throws everyone, his hands steady, his face unreadable. For a man about to be accused of firing from the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository, his behavior makes no sense. A real assassin either dies on the scene or keeps firing until someone puts him down. Oswald fired 3 shots, stashed the rifle, slipped out of the building, made it home, grabbed a pistol, shot a cop, and ended up arrested inside a movie theater. No manifesto, no note, no confession. Not even a hint of motive. His family is baffled, the police are frustrated, and then his mother walks into the station and turns the whole room inside out. Marguerite Oswald doesn't come in grieving. She comes in swinging. She tells anyone who'll listen that her son works for the CIA, that his defection to Russia was part of an intelligence operation, that he served the United States government. The reporters in the room stare at each other, unsure whether to laugh or turn on their tape recorders. Not one paper prints her statements. Too strange, too dangerous, too close to something no one wants to touch. Meanwhile, Oswald keeps denying everything, and the police keep digging. When they search his belongings, they find a handwritten note linking him to the attempted murder of General Edwin Walker. They have photos of the house. They have his wife Marina, admitting he did it, but none of it connects him cleanly to the Kennedy hit. They have his rifle, sure, and they know the weapon was purchased under a name he used in Russia. Alec. But even that raises questions. If he really wanted to kill the president, why go through the trouble of ordering a rifle by mail under an alias? Guns were easy to buy in Texas. He could have walked into any store and walked out with one, no questions asked. The way the rifle was purchased guaranteed that the FBI, and anyone else looking, would be able to run the serial number straight back to him. It looked less like the decision of a lone drifter and more like something built to be found. Then there's the money. Oswald wasn't a man with cash. He was living hand-to-mouth on depository wages, yet the accounting on his expenses never quite lined up. After Jack Ruby shot him on live television, those questions didn't go away. They just got buried under the lone gunman label that Washington needed, wrapped around the case. But while Oswald was still alive, the people closest to the ground weren't buying it. The FBI had already opened their own side investigations. In New Orleans, the district attorney's office issued a warrant for David Ferry. Guy Bannister's name surfaced. The circle tightened around Carlos Marcello's outfit, his brother, his associates, and Oswald's mother kept talking. She wouldn't let it die. She kept insisting her son had ties to U.S. intelligence. By the time Ruby pulled the trigger in the basement of the Dallas police station, those threads didn't disappear. They were just cut short.